Let's do this. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. It's time for another exciting lightning talk. I'm Parag Katkar, your host for tonight. I'm the Senior Director of Enterprise Solutions at Enrhythm, and we have a lot of exciting content lined up for you in the upcoming weeks. Our lightning talks are hosted every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And each week, one of our practice area consultants speak on the latest and greatest technology trends in the industry that will keep you learning and growing in your career. So this week, Paul, who's an awesome software engineer with us, will give us an overview of CSS modules. He's going to explain what CSS modules are, why, and how you should use them. So without further ado, let's get it started, Paul.
All right, what's going on, everyone? I'm excited to share CSS modules with you. I think you're going to find it very useful. I gave it the subtitle, Isolating CSS Within JavaScript Components. So my goal is to explain CSS modules well enough for you to be productive, because really, when someone guides you through it, it's quite a simple concept. But if you already have a favorite way of implementing CSS, don't think you have to pick and choose between the two at the moment. There are some strategic ways to use both of them. If you like CSS modules a lot, you can use them solely. But as your guide, I'm here to help you understand the benefits and the trade-offs. And I think you're going to understand quite a bit by the end. So first, an example for context. Before we start getting into the details, just to have a general idea of what's going on, we have a CSS file, which is normally named something after your component, like button.module.css, something like that. And you can see we have regular CSS within, which is usually a class, very simple. We're importing it within our JavaScript. And then this variable styles is going to hold all the CSS class names from our CSS file within an object. And we're going to access that like so to get our class names. And what something like Webpack, a bundler, is going to do is turn our original CSS class name into something that's going to be unique. And so classes aren't going to conflict with each other. So here we're getting a prefix and suffix. This might be different depending on how Webpack is configured, but the general idea, we're going to get our classes unique. And then this is what's going to be outputted within the HTML. So you can see that those match. But yeah, that's essentially what we're doing. We're importing styles, using it within our JavaScript, and we're scrambling the CSS class names to make sure it's unique to avoid some specificity and cascading issues with CSS. But if you look online, the definition you'll find of CSS modules is a CSS file in which all the class names and animation names are scoped locally by default. How I would put it is that we're creating CSS files to be utilized locally within our components we're building with JavaScript. So at first I'm like, is CSS modules part of CSS itself? And that is not correct. It's not something that the browser naturally understands or is part of CSS naturally. We need something like Webpack, a bundler, to make it work. So yeah, we're writing CSS classes, we're importing them within our JavaScript, and then using it within the markup. A couple of extra things. If we want to extend our CSS classes, we can do that with the composes keyword here, whether it's within the same CSS module file or not. So we'll see this more in the demo, but I just want you to know that yes, we are trying to keep our JavaScript or our styles within our JavaScript components, but we can extend the CSS classes so we're not repeating ourselves a lot. And there are times where you want the CSS selectors to be global. And there is a syntax and a way to do that within CSS modules, which is right here, which we'll see in a demo as well. There's no better way to understand it other than just to see it working. And I think seeing it working will clear up a lot of the details about it. So let's look at what we have. We just have a very simple React component here, app, which is usually the beginning of your app. And we have some very simple markup here, which is just to understand CSS modules. And we're going to start with our CSS module right here with a very simple CSS class. And a very simple web page. So right off the bat, I just want to show you this object that is being generated. So you can see, yeah, it's a very simple object and it's just linking to a string that's scrambled. And this is a Create React app and how they configured CSS modules. So that's how they decided to do a prefix of app and then there's scrambling at the end. So then also, there's two ways that you can configure Webpack to output the styles, the real CSS. One way is with a style tag within the head, which is what we're doing here, or Create React App is doing. Another way is to output another CSS file to include, which is good for caching and whatnot. But today we'll just review it this way. And you can see, yeah, it's just regular CSS. Once we get to this point, we're going to understand completely how it's working. And then we're going to look at the markup and we see like that text center class is right here. So classes are a simple concept, but let's look at what if we want to have some additional selectors or we want to use more CSS selectors. Well, we're always going to start off with a class or an ID because the way it's working is you don't have anything extra within the styles object, but let's look at what it's outputting. You can see that this is still very regular CSS. So as long as we put the extra CSS selectors after, we're fine, it'll work. Same thing here. You can see that we're adding some more selectors, but we're not getting anything extra in the object, but regular CSS still. And pseudo selectors work the same. So this is just showing you that you're not going to run into any problems if it's after the class name or ID name. Now, one thing that is surprising at first is if you want to select an ID with CSS modules, you can see here that it's part of the styles object, and I'm actually using it as the ID name. And then you're getting the output of that scrambled ID here. So that's how IDs are going to work. You're going to have to name the ID that scrambled output, or you're going to use styles.new to do that. But there's cases when we don't have control over what the ID is. Say we're pulling in some markup from some API, and it's going to be dynamically loaded. We're not going to be able to change the ID in the markup. In that case, we have to use a global. There's not a way to do it, at least a way I could find with CSS modules. So we'll have to, because just think like anything you're putting in here regularly is going to get scrambled. So that's obviously not going to match. That's not going to match which is coming in. So yeah, globals will work as expected. It's just a unscrambled, scrambled global selector here. And then one problem I ran into is, this is a perfectly fine, well-named CSS class with some dashes in between. But if we come here, we can see, well, that breaks the dot notation of JavaScript with properties of an object, right? So of course our app is not going to work anymore. So if we have class names that don't work well with that notation, then we just have to use the bracket notation. So let's just fix that. And then that works fine. Let's see here. Let's just check our object. So yeah, that'll still work fine. Okay, so that's within our app component. Let's try it again with an extra component of buttons. And okay, so that's just a regular class, but then here's where we're extending classes. So we're not repeating ourselves because we don't want to do that. You can see that, yes, we can have some CSS modules for a specific component, but you can also have something like margin module.css and put that in a styles folder, and then put all your margin classes in there, and then extend your other classes like I'm doing here. So I'm grabbing MT20 to add a bunch of margin at the top from a different CSS module. And then I'm also extending button padding within the same file to the button. And then we already saw that pseudo classes work. So yeah, and then the object looks as expected. This is the same thing we've been going over. Okay, so then this is, that's like the gist of it. That's like, you can get very far with what we've just learned right now. But one thing that gets me really excited for using CSS modules is media queries, because if you use a CSS framework, usually there are some predefined breakpoints that if you're building like a really nice graphical, very complex UI that's going to have a lot going on, you might have like a certain image that just looks right at a certain width, but then at 990 pixels, you wish you just had different CSS properties, styles to make it look better, but you're not quite there at the 1024 pixel breakpoint or something. And yeah, there's always a way to extend frameworks and get it to work, but I really like how CSS modules, you can have breakpoints at any point in time, like we're doing here, like when the browser's 325 pixels, 422, 488. These are not normal breakpoints, but say I wanted very specific styles at these breakpoints. You can see that the button is changing based on those breakpoints, and it's just regular CSS that outputs. And yeah, you can do this with, this is regular CSS, so you can do it in another way, but it's just really nice and organized when it's all in one place with the idea of it being within one component. It's just less mental complexity for doing your media queries. But yeah, like that, like this, it will get you very far. I was just wondering, before I move on, does anyone have any questions before I leave the demo? Anything that anyone wants to see? Just pause for a quick moment. Okay, well, we'll save some questions for the end then. So let's go back and review the benefits. So styles are going to be encapsulated within our components. It just makes sense. Like you have your markup, you have your JavaScript, just to keep your styles all within the same place. It's natural. We can avoid running into specificity issues. If the project still has global styles, if it's not completely using CSS modules, it is possible that global styles can be more specific and outweigh some of our CSS modules. But know too that you can try and make your styles more specific in your CSS modules by adding more selectors the best you can. But usually, like if you have some global styles, they're very general. They're selecting like all the paragraphs, or they're just resetting some browser default behavior. So you don't really run into that, but it is possible that even your CSS modules might be overpowered by globals, and you might still have to reference the global style sheet. But generally, you don't have to. We're working with regular CSS properties. And some of you might know that I like Tailwind CSS. Tailwind is great, but you're using their class names. And so, yeah, I've become more accustomed to their class names than regular CSS properties, right? So if you want to make sure you're still using CSS properties frequently to always be in tune with them, this is a great option. So you're just using regular CSS. And many common front-end solutions come with it configured. And we didn't go over configuring Webpack because that would be going into the weeds, and there's actually a lot of good documentation on how to do it. I didn't have any problems, but a lot of times you're not going to be configuring it. It's already built in to say like Next.js, Gatsby, Create React App, or I'm sure with other JavaScript frameworks, it's configured. So you might not even have to worry about setting up Webpack. Some other considerations, if you like Sass, there's something called Sass modules, the CSS modules, plus some Sass capabilities. So some of you might be into that. Yeah, in practice, when I'm actually using CSS modules, I still wanted to use some globals. And if you want to do that, say you want some standard margins, and you could still keep it within CSS modules, but if you decide to use globals, it's nice because you can easily tell what's from the CSS module because you're using the styles object and accessing it versus just a regular string that you can just tell the difference of, okay, what's global, what's not. But it's up to you. So you still need to, if you're using many styles, you still are going to want to find a good way to create your complete string of all your CSS classes. And if you accept props from your for your JavaScript components, you can change the styling based on different props you're receiving. You're going to want an easier way to create that string because you're not just purely typing in CSS class names into as a string anymore. You're actually creating a string. So class names is a great library for this, where you can conditionally join class names together based on the props or other variables. I won't go into that much further, but in practice, I found myself wanting to use a library like that when using CSS modules. If you use TypeScript, Webpack can generate additional files with this file extension where it's going to make the CSS modules type safe. So no problems there if you like TypeScript. And something I haven't tried before, and I'm not sure how natural it is, but if you really wanted to use CSS modules server side, there's a post CSS plugin. But really, it's more natural to use with JavaScript. So yeah, keep learning about CSS modules and give it a shot. If you're building UI with JavaScript, it's a common option that's within the documentation of like Next.js or Gatsby or any other framework. If you're starting to run into cascading problems with your CSS, it might be a good idea to start using just class names and CSS modules to keep everything within your components and easier to understand within your project. As your project scales, if you have a different solution that is becoming unmanageable, you can start the process of migrating to CSS modules while you keep the old. That's usually easy to do. Yeah, if you're moving away from legacy CSS, the same thing. Like, it's easy to start moving away while you're removing old legacy CSS and adding CSS modules. And sometimes you need to make some component-specific CSS changes quickly. We all have been in a hurry at times, wanting to get something done or fix something quick. CSS modules, even if it's not the best, most organized CSS, at least it's within one specific area, and it's not going to be affecting other parts of the project. So yeah, think of CSS modules when you run